All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on a hidden network, one that ties together our health, our safety, and even the food on our plates in ways you've probably never even thought about.
So think about it for a second. A deadly virus, an international crime ring, and the future of our food. I mean, on the surface, those things sound like they're from totally different worlds, right? A pandemic, these super sophisticated global criminals, and then this huge challenge of how we're going to feed everyone. But they're not separate. They're all tangled up in this invisible web. And the common thread? It all comes back to the global trade of wildlife.
Okay, so to really get how this web works, let's break it down. We'll start by looking at these three major crises that, again, seem to have nothing to do with each other.
First up, something we all know way too well. A new zoonotic disease emerges, and before you know it, it's a full-blown global pandemic. We've seen how this can absolutely hammer the world economy, costing tens of billions of dollars, and just completely reshaping our world.
All right, crisis number 2. Well, all that's happening, you've got transnational organized crime just exploding. And listen, we're not talking about small-time crooks here. These are massive global networks. They're using the latest tech and operating across borders with the kind of sophistication you'd expect from a Fortune 500 company.
And then there's the third crisis. A quieter one, but just as serious. It's happening in our food systems. The problem is we have these huge blind spots. We're pretty good at tracking how much food is produced, but we have almost no idea who's eating what or why. And if you don't have that data, trying to build a sustainable food system for a growing planet, it's like flying blind.
So, you've got the pandemic, the crime, the food crisis. How in the world do they connect? Well, here it is, the global wildlife trade, and more specifically, something called bushmeat. This is the hidden connection, the point where all these threads cross.
So what exactly is bushmeat? Put simply, it's meat that comes from wild animals. And we're not talking about just a few specific animals here. The range is enormous. Think everything from insects and reptiles all the way up to birds and even primates like apes. For a lot of communities, this is a really critical source of protein and money. But it comes with some major risks.
And that risk brings us to this key idea, zoonotic disease. It's pretty straightforward. It's an infectious disease that jumps from an animal to a human. But here's the part that you really need to grasp. The vast majority of new diseases, the ones we call emerging infectious diseases, they're almost all zoonotic. They start in animals.
You know, people have been hunting wildlife for food forever, but the risk factor has completely changed. In the past, hunting was mostly for subsistence, right? It was local, so if a disease did jump to a person, it tended to stay contained in a small community. But today, it's a whole different ballgame. We've built this massive global commercial trade network. It's basically a superhighway for viruses, connecting the most remote parts of the world directly to huge cities and international airports. It just dramatically dials up the risk of a small local outbreak turning into a global nightmare.
Okay, so how does a virus actually make that journey? I mean, from an animal in a remote forest to a person in a city thousands of miles away. Let's trace the actual pathway.
It happens in a few key stages. Step 1 is the hunt itself. A scratch, a bite, any kind of direct contact. But step 2, the butchering process, that's where the risk really skyrockets. You've got direct exposure to blood and tissue. After that, step 3, the meat gets into the trade networks. It travels from a rural village to a big city market. And finally, step 4, that's the spillover. Somewhere along that chain, the virus makes the jump and finds its first human host.
And that second step, butchering, is really the flashpoint. Just look at this number, it's pretty staggering. A study in Sierra Leone found that almost 40% of bushmeat handlers said they cut themselves on a regular basis. Think about that. Every single one of those cuts, especially without protective gear, is a potential open door for a virus to cross over.
And this is not some kind of what-if scenario. This exact process is how we got some of the most devastating diseases in modern history. HIV? It came from simian immunodeficiency virus in chimps, likely crossing over through blood contact during a hunt. Ebola and Marburg? Outbreaks are repeatedly linked to handling infected great apes and bats. We even see it with things like monkeypox, which comes from rodents that are routinely hunted. And it's happening right now. Scientists are finding antibodies for deadly henipaviruses in people who butcher fruit bats. The spillover is an ongoing event.
So, okay, we've got the immense disease risk. But that global trade network we've been talking about, it's not just a public health issue. It's also become an incredibly profitable superhighway for some of the most dangerous criminal groups on the planet.
The term law enforcement uses for this is crime convergence, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's when an organized crime group, one that's already trafficking drugs or guns, for example, realizes, hey, we can make money trafficking wildlife too. They just add it to their business model. They use the exact same smuggling routes, the same money laundering schemes, the same corrupt contacts to move elephant ivory or pangolin scales as they do to move a kilo of cocaine.
And this isn't a small-time thing. The convergence is massive. In fact, research shows that the #1 crime that overlaps with the illegal wildlife trade is drug trafficking. It's often the very same people using the very same networks to move both.
What's really interesting is that it's not all the same. When you dig into the data, you start to see these patterns. Different wildlife products tend to get tangled up with different types of crime. So for example, ivory and rhino horn, that trade is often linked to things like threat finance and high-level corruption. But then you look at something like pangolins or reptiles, and you see a really strong connection to drug trafficking and money laundering. It's a whole complex criminal ecosystem.
Okay, so we've laid out this huge interconnected problem. You've got pandemics, organized crime, food security, all tangled together. So how on earth do you even begin to fight back against something so complex and hidden? Well, more and more, the answer is coming down to one thing: data.
Just get a load of this number, 7.4 billion. That's how many times law enforcement searched Interpol's global databases in 2023 alone. That breaks down to over 230 searches every single second of every single day. That is the sheer scale of the data sharing that's happening right now, with police in nearly 200 countries working together to track criminals and illegal goods across borders in real time.
And this whole fight is getting smarter and more data-driven. On one side, you have law enforcement using incredible new tools. Things like Interpol's Biometric Hub, which lets police forces instantly share fingerprints and facial recognition data across the globe. That's the crime-fighting front. But at the same time, on a completely different front, scientists are using data to tackle that food security piece of the puzzle.
Let's dig into that food data for a second, because it's a real game changer. This thing, the Aquatic Food Composition Database, is incredible. It doesn't just count fish by the ton. No, it profiles over 3,000 different aquatic species and details their actual nutrient content, the iron, the zinc, the omega-3s. It even breaks it down by whether the fish was wild or farmed, fresh or dried. This is the kind of detailed information that lets policymakers make smart decisions, to stop thinking just about calories and start thinking about delivering real nutrition to the people who need it most. So a big question is, who foots the bill for all of this? Well, if you look at how an organization like Interpol is funded, you can see it's a real team effort. Almost half comes from the required contributions from member countries. But look at this, the majority, over 50%, comes from voluntary cash donations and other contributions. It shows that countries, organizations, and partners all over the world get it. A global problem needs a global response.
And this quote from Chris Golden over at Harvard really just hits the nail on the head. If you only think about something like fisheries in terms of dollars and cents, you miss most of its true value. You have to see the whole picture, how it connects to nutrition, to public health, to security, to the environment. Because when you mismanage one piece of that puzzle, you end up creating crises in all the others.
So, here we are. We started with what looked like 3 totally separate problems, and we followed the threads to find this single, hidden, interconnected web. And what's amazing is that with new data and new kinds of cooperation, we can actually see this network for the first time. We can see how a virus, a crime ring, and our food supply are all linked. The visibility is there. So the real question now is, what are we going to do with what we can now see?